Good morning, magandang hapon, magandang umaga, wherever you are. Welcome to the PhilS4 webinar series. Today's webinar is by Dr. Sharmila Parmanand of the LSE, Saving Our Sisters, Exploring the Politics of Anti-Trafficking and Sex Work in the Philippines. My name is Mark Thompson, Director of the Southeast Asia Research Center at the City University of Hong Kong. So we're all over the world. We'd also like to thank Roxanne coordinating from the Philippines, and Sharmila, of course, is in the UK. So welcome also to our viewers from the various locations where you are. Sharmila is a fellow in development studies at the London School of Economics, the LSE. She has a PhD in multidisciplinary gender studies from the University of Cambridge, in which she had a Gates Scholarship. Her doctoral research examines sex trafficking discourses and interventions in the Philippines from a critical perspective. And of course, she'll be talking about some of that research today. Most of her projects have interrogated how development and state interventions targeted at women in the global South reflect and shape their lived realities with a focus on gender and international development. She also has a master's in development studies from the University of Melbourne on an Australian Leadership Award Scholarship and a BA in political science from Ateneo de Manila University. She was previously a gender and human rights teaching fellow at the LSE and a lecturer at the University of Vermont Department of Theater, as well as at Ateneo de Manila Department of English and Literature. She's already got several publications, just mentioned a couple here. Forthcoming one on regulating motherhood through markets, forthcoming in Feminist Review, and one in the European Journal of for Women's Studies, a very interesting piece on macho populists versus COVID. So it's with great pleasure, Sharmila, that we come to listen to your talk about your recent research on sex trafficking. So for everybody who's new to this, Dr. Parmanand will speak for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have about half an hour for questions via the chat box. So thanks all for attending, and we look forward to your talk, Sharmila.
Thank you very much, Mark, and to the organizers. So I'll be talking about part of my dissertation project, which I'm now converting into a book. I've chosen specific sections of it given the time constraints. But before that, I just wanted to establish some context. Why is the Philippines a valuable case study for anti-trafficking in the first place? And in 2016, the Philippine government celebrated a really big win. It was upgraded to the Tier 1 ranking in the US Department of State Trafficking in Persons report. This report is considered an authority in assessing anti-trafficking efforts of governments around the world. And the Philippines has attained this ranking for 7 years in a row, the best an Asian nation has done. And the Philippine government is widely considered a global expert in conducting anti-trafficking. Other countries send delegations to do study tours to learn from the Philippine government. And it's established itself as an expert quite early on. So in May 2002, it became the first Asia-Pacific nation to ratify the UN Anti-Trafficking Protocol. So my preoccupation here is to some extent looking at anti-trafficking not as an uncontroversial, uncontested victory for human rights and feminism, especially given the intellectual and political stakes, but asking what other hierarchies might have been reproduced or intensified under the anti-trafficking regime. Might it be a site of ambivalence rather than, uncontroversial success? So these are the key questions I explore in my dissertation. I'll just focus on the first two parts for this talk. If you want to ask questions about the next two, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A. So in part one, I'm going to ask, how is sex work represented and addressed in Philippine anti-trafficking laws, policies, practices, and related legislation? How did this dominant understanding of sex work as uniquely victimizing emerge? In part two, I will discuss how this dominant understanding of sex work compares with Filipino sex workers' own reflections on their lived experiences. And think through how Filipino sex workers experience anti-trafficking interventions. Another important intervention with my work is navigating ethical and methodological issues in researching sex work. So alongside the Philippine Sex Workers Collective, which is a coalition of sex worker groups around the Philippines who are not legally registered. They can't because sex work is criminalized. And most of them remain anonymous in their political advocacy. They do have a very active social media presence. So I developed a collaborative research program with them and worked with them to conduct this research. I spoke to over 50 sex workers in Manila who were based in brothels, bars, and who also operated on the street, and a few other freelancers. And I made sure that I was speaking to a range of sex workers, so not all of them were members of the collective. And I'm happy to expound on the methodology in the Q&A. And finally, reimagining anti-trafficking away from carceral approaches towards more labor and social justice frameworks. So moving on to the first part, how is sex work dominantly represented, and how did this policy regime, how did this dominant understanding of sex work emerge? I want to do a quick note on terminology because I know I'm making use of some technical terms to make sure we're on the same page. So trafficking is essentially the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of people through force, fraud, deception, or abuse of vulnerability, which is a very broad category, with the aim of exploiting them for profit. So the Philippines was one of the first few countries to enact domestic anti-trafficking legislation quite early in the game. And the Interagency Council Against Trafficking, or IACAT, and I'll be mentioning them quite a bit in this presentation, is tasked with implementing anti-trafficking laws. So just a quick note on IACAT. It's also seen as a global best practice of our government because it formalizes cooperation between government agencies and non-government organizations. So it has a broad membership. So its permanent members include government agencies such as the Department of Justice, Department of Labor and Employment, Philippine Commission on Women, the police and the National Bureau of Investigation, the Bureau of Immigration, etc. And it has 3 members from the NGO community who are elected to 3-year terms, but they need to be voted in by the government members. So in the context in which I'm using sex worker here is to refer to adults who receive money or goods in exchange for sexual services. They are incredibly diverse in terms of mode of operation and levels of precarity. We do not have any reliable data in terms of the numbers of sex workers in the Philippines. They are predominantly, but not exclusively, women. LGBT individuals, especially trans women, are disproportionately represented in sex work because of job discrimination elsewhere. And within sex work, there are hierarchies of privilege and precarity as well. So street workers and brothel-based workers and massage-based workers are the most vulnerable. And so these are the sectors that I focused on in my dissertation because they are the paradigmatic cases that are discussed within anti-trafficking as well. But we also have our higher-end escorts and increasingly online sex workers and camp performers. People's engagement in sex work is quite discontinuous. Some of them do it full time, but for others, there are some interruptions or they combine it with other income generating strategies. So under the Philippine law, under the revised penal code, sex workers are regarded as criminal. So the sale of sex is criminal. But under the Magna Carta for women, they're seen as victims, and it's only the buyers and the third parties who are seen as criminal. And so there is that legal tension that also plays out in local jurisdiction. So we have very confused governance infrastructure for sex work. So what is the dominant understanding of sex work in the context of anti-trafficking and even women's rights legislation in the Philippines? Because they go hand in hand. There's a big distinction that's drawn between sex and labor. And so with respect to other forms of precarious women's work or feminized work, such as domestic work, that orientation has been to increase the bargaining position of the worker and to involve workers in consultations and to try to grant them more formal rights and protection while recognizing the precarity and the vulnerability of these workers. And so you see how, Batas Kasambahay, which the Philippines is also this landmark legislation in protecting domestic workers, also a world leader in this, um, recognizes domestic worker rights. But in the context of sex work, though, it's taken a radically different approach. So here I've taken from the Philippine Commission on Women's briefings, and this anti-prostitution law is endorsed by IACAT and the entire anti-trafficking sector, um, tend to portray sex work as something that is done to other people. So the language that's used here is prostitution or women in prostitution. So sex work does not appear in any of our laws or our policies. And there's a conflation often between sex work and trafficking. Not all the time, but a lot of times, right? And so the policy regime around sex work is very different to domestic work or other forms of precarious work. It involves raids, rescue operations, and rehabilitation. And in general, women's rights groups and the anti-trafficking sector have been backing a law that would repeal the criminalization of the sale of sex work, but still end demand and end the industry by criminalizing buyers and third parties. And I'm happy to expound on the risks of that kind of law in the Q&A. Now, how did this policy regime emerge? There was a confluence of factors that intersected, right? One, I'm sure most of us are familiar with the broader debate within the feminist movement about sex work and pornography. And the Philippines happens to be the Asia Pacific headquarters of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, which is one pole of this debate that advocates against prostitution and pornography in all of its forms. So the enactment of the anti-trafficking law represented a political opportunity to entrench this specific understanding of sex work or prostitution. But it also has to do with the shape of women's and leftist movements in the Philippines. So there's strong involvement of feminist nuns and the faith-based sector, which tend to have more conservative orientations towards sex work and prostitution. So would be more sympathetic to the view of rescuing women and punishing men who purchase sex. The organizational structure of IACAT, as I've foreshadowed in the beginning, also contributes to this in that NGOs serve at the behest of government partners, and a seat at IACAT is incredibly prestigious because it communicates to the funders and constituencies of these NGOs that they have real power, that they are able to shape policy. And so this is a coveted seat. But at the same time, it does serve a disciplinary function because it becomes difficult for NGOs to openly disagree with the position of government partners. And I mean, Roldan and many other scholars have written about the shape of civil society government relations in the Philippines, have pointed out these cooperative partnerships and some of the risks, as well as the opportunities. Finally, a lot of this is also very donor driven. So the United States Trafficking in Persons report for the longest time measured countries' efforts based on prosecution and conviction rates, which meant it nudged countries towards a carceral approach because the incentive structure of countries is that we have to catch people, we have to criminalize. The Philippine government takes deep pride in its tier 1 ranking in this report and thus would like to maintain that. Another thing about the US anti-trafficking agenda is that the US is the biggest donor for anti-trafficking globally and definitely for the Philippines. So based on available data, it's given $16 million until 2012 only, but there's a lot more after that. It's just not available yet, to anti-trafficking funding. So this is to either foreign NGOs, the Philippine government, or local NGOs operating in the Philippines. But US anti-trafficking funding is subject to a prohibition on the promotion or advocacy of prostitution, which then creates a financial incentive for organizations in this space to not touch that issue and makes it then hard for organizations with divergent views to enter the space. So that's broadly how this policy regime emerged. Obviously, there are more sophisticated connections that I draw in the actual dissertation. Now, another point I'd like to highlight about all these like conflicting policies on sex work at the moment, on the one hand, it's criminalized. On the other hand, they're seen as victims, but it's also tacitly condoned by some local governments, is at no point in the design of any of these policies were sex workers themselves consulted. So they were generally not involved in any of these conversations. What happened was anti-trafficking prostitution survivors played a central role in consultations, in speaking at Senate hearings. And this is incredibly important because their experience is valuable. At the same time, they don't represent the full spectrum of people engaged in sex work. So the parallel here would be only talking to overseas Filipino migrants who were trafficked in designing policies on migration, which is essentially what happened in the case of sex work. So anyone who identified as a sex work did not get an opportunity, as a sex worker, did not get an opportunity to participate in these conversations or to be meaningfully heard. And the Philippine Sex Workers Collective is pushing back against that with their slogan, "Nothing about us without us." They have very active social media presence. I'll show you more photos of that in a bit. And so in my work, I also deal with themes of epistemic injustice. So injustice done to people in their capacity as knowers, when on the basis of their identity, they are seen as less credible, they are pathologized as too damaged, too traumatized to be able to adjudicate what is in their best interest, or those of them who are able to come forward and withstand the risks of criminalization, harassment, or being outed to their communities are written off as too privileged to represent everyone else, right? So these are things I also cover. Let's move on to part 2. So how does the dominant understanding of sex work compare with Filipino sex workers' own reflections on their lived experiences, and how have they experienced anti-trafficking interventions? I want to clarify that I am not making a general statement on behalf of all Filipino sex workers. I recognize the diversity of the community. I've taken steps to try to represent that. But what I am doing here is showing that the reality is far more complex than all of them are victims, and that the current representation flattens their experiences into that unidimensional, understanding. Okay. Broadly, based on my conversations with them, what's occurring is that both empowerment and exploitation are happening in the same frame. And their engagement in sex work and continuing to engage in it is a result of a mix of consent and coercion. So binary thinking in academic scholarship and even in policy formulation was incredibly unhelpful here. So one key theme that emerged was sex work was actually a practice of care, a way for them to become good mothers. So many were single mothers or had been single for a significant period of time. So the higher hourly rates and flexible working hours in sex work were essential. So many of them had actually worked previously in factories or as domestic workers, and they said they missed important milestones in their kids' lives. They couldn't be there to care for them when their kids were sick. And so they wanted that proximity to their children. And here I'm foregrounding a lot of their quotes, both as a matter of politics, but I think because they deliver the point a lot better than I could. So some questions they've asked is, why do we view overseas Filipino workers as modern day heroes, but sex workers as a social cancer? We are both trying to feed our kids. Why are our contributions invisible? They call us bad mothers because we are sex workers. But if our kids go hungry and we can't send them to school, then we're also bad, right? So we can't win. Are you going to feed my child with your clean money? Why should I be ashamed? My work is clean and honest. I don't steal. I don't rape. It keeps my family alive. Of course, in my dissertation, I do reflect on how stigmatized populations tend to self-represent to researchers, and I'm happy to have a chat about that. And I recognize that some of this distancing and exercising virtue is also a reaction to the stigma around them. But this is not a thing that we can just dismiss in our analysis. There were, and then obviously their subjectivities are quite complex. So there were also responses from the same people that indicate that they see sex work as significantly less dehumanizing than other work and more rewarding. In fact, it is a form of resisting their displacement in the labor market. And one of them says, this is why they're afraid of us. Who will they exploit in factories when we realize we can actually take control of our sexuality in some way? And as I've said, many of them had actually previously worked in other precarious jobs and then moved into sex work. One of them asked a really cheeky question. What situation for women involves the risk of violence and forced sex, often without anything in exchange? Why aren't you banning marriage then? And the Philippines is, famously known for high rates of domestic violence. And this was a sex worker who had left her abusive partner because she was able to, from her income in sex work, and who described her engagement in sex work, apologies, as fucking my way from no freedom to some freedom. And I argue that that has to be part of the analysis, right? The coercion of entering into sex work has to be balanced against the coercion of removing them from that and making the coercion in making them dependent on family members who are abusive. Some of them recognize that they want to capitalize on physical attractiveness to avoid underpaid, tedious, and menial work. So you give me a broom, you'll make me scrub toilets, move me to the kitchen from the bar. Will that make you happy? And there was a lot of pride in diskarte, which is a local word that roughly means making do with resources one has in competitive context, so craftiness, quick thinking. So broadly, this is how they make sense of their lived realities, and it doesn't quite line up with dominant representations and assumptions on which anti-trafficking policy is being drawn. In terms of how they experience these interventions, many of them had experienced being raided or rescued, and actually they conflate both raid and rescue, which is already quite telling. They also conflate shelter, rehabilitation with detention, because that is how they experience it. And so in their experiences of being raided, they get outed to their communities, they get extracted from their income generating sources. And while they are waiting for the case to progress, or where they're in shelters, they're unable to earn money for their families, and their families starve. And many of them have said that the raids are really just a pretext for extortion. And there's been an entire microeconomy of bribery that's sprouted up around this, where they just preemptively pay cops to not raid or rescue them. And many of them go back to sex work after being raided and rescued, after paying fines or bribes. And there is a mismatch between official policies and their preferences. So from the collective's page, they say, you know, you're talking about us again. This was during the time the IACAT was holding consultations and didn't invite them. And they were like, you know, you're probably talking about how to help us again. Here's a series of messages. Don't talk to me about sewing machines. Talk to me about sex worker rights, right? And a lot of them push back against the rehabilitation complex. I'm not saying rehabilitation is never necessary for any victim of violence, but the blunt way in which it's applied at the moment has resulted in some sex workers who don't want to be there, who escape the rehab centers, being subjected to moralizing discourses, being redirected to low-paid, labor-intensive jobs that lead to them actually working longer hours, but these jobs just happen to be virtuous. There is no robust monitoring of what happens to women after rehabilitation, if their life outcomes are indeed better, if their well-being is indeed improved. A lot of times the assistance is conditional on them cooperating with the prosecution, and that's again tied to incentives to increase prosecution and conviction rates, but that might not be in the best interest of anyone, or they may not see their third parties and managers as criminals necessarily. And many of them report that they had to provide a credible performance of victimhood in order to get access to support and resources. Yep, exactly 20 minutes. So I'm just going to end there. And here are some related publications drawn from my dissertation if you'd like to have a look. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharmila, for that comprehensive talk. And so to the audience, I believe you should come in through the chat box, and I see a couple of questions are coming in, but while more come in, let me just ask you to expound a bit more on what I see you just setting up as a contradiction. So the Philippines is kind of held up as this, you know, model in Southeast Asia, progressive in terms of trafficking. The reality is much messier, and you know, the policy, the governance strategy is fundamentally contradictory. Are we talking about victims? Are we talking about criminals? So I wondered if you could be a bit more explicit about that. And you know, you talked, perhaps it's helpful to talk about the interest groups. So you talked about the U.S. government, which is kind of takes a penal approach. It wants, you know, arrests and indications that the crackdown is occurring. You talked about the NGOs, and maybe perhaps more about their agendas. And you didn't mention the church. I'm wondering if the Catholic Church plays a role in this, the whole moral discourse on you know, sex work and so on. You did that. Maybe you could expand on a couple of those points.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Yeah, so when I say messy, it's because this confluence is almost, you know, almost incidental in that feminist groups, I don't think, are deeply invested in a carceral approach. I think if you speak to the feminist groups involved, like the Coalition Against Trafficking Women or Opla Center, which at one point was deeply engaged in feminist issues as well, or Visayan Forum at one point, what they will say is they think poverty is the primary driving force, right? But at the same time, where they land at the end of this is sex work can never be a choice. And so that is their agenda. And the US government comes in with a slightly more, so a less socially redistributive agenda and a more penal one, partly also of the domestic politics around international aid in the US and the capture of the system by like the Christian right or more conservative groups, right? So the US comes in with a lot of money and that agenda, and somehow they then align on policy, even if their intentions are not, their intentions are not exactly the same. And in the context of the Philippines, some of these organizations that have held seats in the IACAT for the longest time, some of these NGOs include, so CATWAP, as I've been saying, which is inherent, like has been created to oppose pornography and prostitution. And then you have the International Justice Mission, which is a US-based organization, also very Christian and conservative in their outlook. And they receive a lot of funding to do work in the Philippines. And in terms of local organizations, the civil society space in the Philippines does have a lot of faith-based organizations because of colonial legacies, right? And so they all just seem to converge on this position without necessarily like coordinating it. To speak more broadly to anti-trafficking, it is a very vexed institution, and it has been criticized by other scholars for entrenching border control, pushing for punishing small fish instead of really pushing for more socially redistributive and materially redistributive policies to minimize vulnerabilities. I mean, we have immigration raids on undocumented migrants in the name supposedly of protecting and rescuing them, but then they get deported to their home countries, which were supposed to be the source of their vulnerabilities. So anti-trafficking is implicated in all those sorts of politics as well. And there didn't seem to be that much of a conversation about it in the Philippines, but there has been. Like scholars like Rachel Pareñas or Mina Roses have picked up on this. And I wanted to take this in the direction of sex workers more explicitly.
Thanks. So let me just go through some of the questions here. The first is if you could put up your bibliography slide again. There's some those who asked that could take a quick screenshot as we put it up. And then the next question is, thanks for the great presentation and this research. Do you have data on how the pandemic impacted sex work in the Philippines?
There are two things I want to highlight about that. This is obviously qualitative data. One is there's been a shift to online sex work. So individuals selling sexual content via Twitter or social media or OnlyFans. Obviously, not everyone could make this shift because that requires some degree of tech savviness, comfort with your privacy being privacy issues, for example, or also knowing how to market yourself, right? So that was one trend. The other one is it has massively increased their precarity because they couldn't work for the longest time. And the Philippine Sex Workers Collective, for example, their resources were wiped out during the pandemic. They were already they were self-funded to begin with. So it's increased people's precarity, but people are returning to sex work now.
Another question is, what are the standards of qualifying the Philippines as the top country when in fact we see there are discrepancies here and there? Thanks for this really interesting paper.
So the US Trafficking in Persons report is something that the American government just does in some ways to project authority in this field, right? And they rank countries in terms of tiers, and they rank countries based on how they see the government of that country complying with their own US domestic anti-trafficking efforts. So to begin with, this ranking scale is already, it's not coming from nowhere. There are specific vested interests here already. Ironically, the US always gives itself a tier 1 ranking despite its track record with migrants, right? The way the TIP report, the Trafficking Persons Report, is written is they send a committee to each country and they have a conversation with the nonprofit organizations there and with the government agencies there. And admittedly, we are doing good work in some areas. For example, with like online child sex exploitation, although that's a different conversation. Historically, more than 70% of the resources and the cases on anti-trafficking in the Philippines have been with sex trafficking because of this fixation. But they seem to find our report credible. And we have the statistics for prosecution and conviction. That's how they do the rankings.
Okay, thanks for that. From what I understand, trafficking is where exploitation and deception are happening, with victims forced into sex or labor. Sex work is a different thing because there's no force or deception involved. So distinction between trafficking and sex work, I guess, is the question.
Thank you for that question. So I would agree with you, but that distinction is not evident in the way sex work is spoken about in the anti-prostitution law, which is a legislative priority of the Philippine Commission on Women, and which is something that IACAT wholeheartedly backs, right? It's thrown its weight beyond this law, behind this law. So I think where it gets murky is that abuse of the vulnerability of individuals is one of the criteria for when you can establish that it might be trafficking. So if you're able to show that someone's vulnerability was abused for purpose of exploitation, so making profits off them, right, then you can plausibly construct it to be a trafficking case. So that's where the elision starts happening. But yes, I would agree with you that we can't hold a different set of standards for sex work and a different one for other forms of work where clearly there is a mixture of consent and coercion. People are doing it also because of poverty.
Okay, thanks for that too. So there are a couple of methodological questions. One asks about the ethics of your data collection, and another asks about how you establish rapport with your participants before conducting the interviews. Perhaps you can unshare your screen as well now. I think we've got that, yeah.
Okay. Thanks for the questions about the methodology. I did really want an opportunity to expand on that. There is a university ethics process, obviously, where I make sure that I have access to all the resources in case my questions end up triggering participants, where we had a long discussion about how much compensation to provide participants. So on the one hand, so that it's not, an undue inducement for them to participate, but at the same time that I am compensating them for their time and their emotional and intellectual labor. So there were long discussions around that, or even how I could recruit them. So I couldn't approach individuals directly because that would mean outing them and suggesting to them that I thought they were sex workers, which is not an assumption I should be making, right? So I had to ask them to approach me. So there were all these conversations at the university level. But when doing research with sex workers, I think it's a stigmatized community. It's in the case of the Philippines, criminalized. I think it's very important to consult sex worker organizations as well on best practices, which is what I did. So I spoke to sex worker organizations in Canada, in the UK, and the Philippine Sex Workers Collective. So it's almost like I had a second layer of an ethics process. I had to be cleared by them as well. So they had a chat with me about what my motivations were. And I used to work in anti-trafficking in a fairly senior role. So I actually used to advise the government. And so I told them that's where I was coming from, because I saw all these issues with sex workers being really resentful at being put in shelters. And I was wondering, were we actually doing the right thing here? So I explained that to them and built trust over time. So I actually volunteered in the collective for 2 years before beginning my PhD, and gave them a lot of say in the research design. At the same time, made very clear to them that I can't just be dealing with them because they're an overtly politicized group, and I wanted to represent a range. And so using snowball sampling, I also spoke to sex workers who weren't members of the collective. And I was very clear that I would do a validation workshop with them of my findings, but if we disagreed, that I would still go with my interpretation. I think the other thing about sex work research when I approached the collective is they said they absolutely did not trust academics. They did not trust journalists. They did not trust feminists because they've been burned before in terms of people not being careful with security and privacy issues, in terms of people misrepresenting what they say, in terms of people weaponizing their stories of abuse and suffering to suit a different agenda, to push for criminalization, for example. And they said, we want to be represented accurately. And so I understood all of these concerns. Eventually, they were like, okay, you have passed our vetting process. And so they've helped me with recruitment. And I thought, and sometimes there was a peer from the collective sitting in the interviews to make sure that people were comfortable. So I took advice for them on how to manage distress, how to manage, if there's disagreement among my interviewees, whether to do group interviews or individual interviews. So there's a lot of that. And finally, I've said that they can make use of my work for advocacy purposes as long as they represent the findings correctly and accurately, which I think is important because especially with stigmatized populations, the research relationship is incredibly extractive. Like our professional careers improve as a result, but they're still where they are, which is something they've pointed out, right? And so I am also working to make sure that my work is available in non-academic contexts. So this is how I navigated a lot of these things. I don't think it's completely not extractive. You're never going to be able to do that, but I've tried to mitigate against those things. Yeah. And I think that's the methodology.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. There's a kind of technical question here. I'm not sure I fully understand it. We'll just read it. How did the Philippines make Category 1 TIP? What's the prosecution record? And what happened to accusations re corruption in the Visayan Foundation? Sorry, I don't know what the background of that is.
Yeah, that's fair. So I mean, I would probably not put them on tier 1, but based on the review process of the TIP committee that went to the Philippines, I think they found them to be doing enough to make the cutoff. And as I've said, the IACAT model is popular because it really formalizes that cooperation. I don't have the prosecution figures on me now, but it is in my dissertation, which is publicly available. And I think relative to many other countries, the Philippines is ahead in terms of prosecution and conviction. One thing I will say here is, A, it's heavily skewed towards sex trafficking. B, most of the people who have been convicted or prosecuted are themselves, quite poor. And many of them are actually women, which kind of casts doubt on this claim that sex work and prostitution is violence by men against women. I'm going to try to pull up those figures for you before the talk ends, but that's my short answer for how they made Category 1. I'm really not sure. I think also geopolitics might be a factor here. They're a strategic US ally. And Duterte has been a bit problematic. What happened to accusations regarding Visayan Forum? To be honest, I don't know. As of my last awareness, as after the last time I checked, Visayan Forum is not on IACAT anymore, so they didn't get a seat, and they still cannot bid for projects, for USAID projects. But I don't think a formal decision was handed down yet. The US government stands by its accusations.
Speaking of your dissertation, there was a request that you share the where people can access your dissertation. I assume that people can just Google it, but there was a request.
So actually, yeah, absolutely, it's available online. I'll post the link here soon.
Okay, great.
By the way, to Rosemary Wiz, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I do cite you in my dissertation, so thank you, thank you for your work.
You see the next question as well then, Sharmila. Have you explored the border control policies in addressing trafficking in persons? What recommendations have you formulated?
So I have, but that is not an explicit part of my dissertation because I wanted to talk about sex work within the Philippines. Rachel Pereñas writes extensively about that, and her work is excellent, right? So she talks about paternalistic border control policies that actually end up harming rather than helping the people they purport to help, because they increase the costs of migration, which then means people are more likely to be in debt and therefore more likely to be vulnerable to doing things they otherwise would not have done. Sealing Chen has also written extensively about offloading passengers using class criteria or very like forms of sexual surveillance against Philippine migrants. So if you ask me, I think what we should be arguing for is more open borders, not restrictive policies. I think we need a rights-based approach, not a restriction-based approach, because the restrictions just increase vulnerability and increase undocumented migration because people find other ways. Also, then they construct women as, vulnerable victims in waiting that need to be saved by the state and the patriarchy, which positions actors next to each other in very problematic ways, because it positions the state as a rescuer, when in fact the state is complicit in a lot of this because of its failure to uplift people from poverty, for example.
We're doing extremely well here. We've been told that we could probably only get 6 or 7 questions, but we're moving right along. You see the next question as well, asking whether your research has been presented to the government, and maybe throw in the other one, noticeably different views from sex workers who weren't members of the collectives. Maybe those 2 questions together.
So to the government informally, not formally. I also haven't reached out yet because I'm doing the due diligence. I want to update my figures. I mean, I finished my PhD in 2020 and I want to produce that book, but I will reach out soon. It has been presented in other fora though, and I do think that compared to 2016, the conversation on sex work and trafficking in the Philippines has become a lot more sophisticated, but that's on my list. Did I find any different views from sex workers? So in terms of their experiences of raids, rescue operations, and rehabilitation, no. The trauma is the same. The experience of being extorted or having to bribe the cops is the same. The experience of frustration at not being presented with, meaningful alternative livelihood options and just being, told that they're better off working as domestic workers is the same. What's different is, and I do recognize this in the dissertation, is the political vocabulary that they make use of. So those who are not members of the collective don't quite use human rights language. Not all of them even identify with themselves as identify as sex workers in the context of the political category sex work, and that probably makes sense because they weren't exposed to the lexicon, right? And in my methodology, I have an entire section about choosing the best terminology to use for this, because sex worker is not a term you will find in the local language, for example. And they would describe their work as nagbebenta ng ligaya, or selling joy. Consistently, they would all call it nagtatrabaho, which is working. And that is how I've justified still using the term sex worker in the context of the research. So there's some discussion of vernacular conceptions of agency and selling sex as well in the dissertation.
I think you see the next one as well. Official policies being improved. You've kind of addressed that already. You've already talked about this person's thanking you for your work in the women's sector, and will you have more opportunity to share your work with heads of localities where there are sex establishments?
Yeah, I would love to. I think that would be using a slightly different language there, but I'm prepared for that. I mean, that was part of the plan. In terms of official policies being improved, so this is a very delicate balance, being someone who researches on sex work. One criticism of sex worker researchers who themselves don't have a background in sex work, especially because my research is explicitly feminist, is, there is a point at which you don't want to take up too much space, and you don't want to speak for or speak for the community. So I do have recommendations in my dissertation, but the first thing I'm going to say is sex workers need to be part of this discussion. We shouldn't be speaking on their behalf all the time. It's a bit more difficult in the Philippines because they are criminalized, so there's this hesitation to come forward. And in many cases, they have deputized me to do this. So I always tell them that I'm going to do this talk. I'm going to consult with this group. But I think the first thing to do is have an actual conversation with the sex workers. Beyond that, I think we need to look at the evidence. So when they are being rescued and then 2 weeks later, they return to the same bar using a different name, does that suggest that the rescue has been effective? Who made money off that entire process? Was there any redistribution that occurred in that situation? When a sex worker says prosecution is not what they want to do because it's going to put their life on hold for the longest time because they don't think the third parties were actually to blame. In fact, they think they were a source of income. Not all, but some. And when they say they would just like to return to their work to continue to feed their families, is a prosecution-based strategy in their best interest? So we need to start looking at the data beyond the simplistic, prosecution and conviction statistics. So I guess part of my answer. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, Sharmila, it gives me a chance to ask perhaps one other question, which is, given this routine of, arrest and rescue and then extortion and so on and so forth. I mean, did this get it all mixed up with the drug war? Did the drug war have any
Yes.
impact on what you're discussing?
So I've actually written about this in an Open Democracy article, and that's in the list of references I shared. It made it so much harder. And because of this link that exists between sex work and drug use, they've immediately become a lot more vulnerable. So initially, the collective released a strong response against the drug war, and then they stopped talking about it because they realized it made them such a target. And in fact, many sex workers have been murdered in the drug war, but they have not come forward, well, for fear, which is standard for most victims, right? But also for fear of being outed. So their families were ashamed of it coming out that their child was a sex worker, for example, or because they just thought they wouldn't be believed. So this association of sex workers as themselves users or associating with some criminal underworld, right? So they have been disproportionately affected. Not to mention that increasingly, experiences of policemen saying, if you don't do what I want, if you don't give me money, I'm just going to plant drugs on you. And who's going to care? So that was a consistent threat of being framed for drug crimes. And I made a strategic decision in my work beyond that article to not speak more extensively about sex work and drugs because I was worried about highlighting that connection further in a situation where no evidence was necessary to kill people. But yes, that was a problem. So thanks for raising that, Mark.
Sure. So there are more questions about, you see them as well, a position of Philippine feminist women's organizations on the policy when it was crafted. What kind of policies did sex workers see as more important? Did these demands, hopes differ from sex workers working online versus in person?
Thanks, Cheryl, so much for this. So in the last 5 years, I think there has been a bit more diversity in the position of feminist organizations. The dominant ones in policy, so CATWAP, as I've said, International Justice Mission doesn't call itself a feminist organization, but it is crafting policies that have to do with women's precarious labor by virtue of being in IACAT, right? So other organizations like DAWN or Talitakum, so these were the organizations that banded together to campaign for the anti-trafficking law, predominantly have the view that sex work is inherently structurally victimizing. It cannot be labor, right? But that is changing. So increasingly, organizations like LICAN, UP Women's Center, they've started using the word sex work. They've started making the differentiation. In my list of references, I also have an article that I wrote for Open Democracy, mapping out these commitments and explaining why the cost of speaking out for women's organizations is still too high, which is why there is a bit of that discomfort with coming forward and dissenting, partly because of funding, but also because of disciplinary structures within academia and the NGO world in the Philippines. So I explained that in detail in that article. What kind of policies did sex workers see as more important? Well, redistributive policies. They were like, if you really want to help us, then provide us alternatives so that if we want to exit, we can. Second, they did not want police control over their lives. They wanted to be able to interface with the police and report abuses, but that's about it. They didn't want the police to have the power to rescue them or raid them. They were not a fan of the rehabilitation system, except for very few, but the reason they wanted to be in a shelter was because of access to resources. If they could be provided that independently, they would prefer that. So these are some examples. And obviously just really meaningful inclusion in all of these policy processes. In terms of online, versus in person, so I am less familiar with online sex work research. It's just an emerging phenomenon in the context of the Philippines, but there is a lot of discussion about digital privacy and how that can be protected. And also all these online payment platforms have started banning sex workers. So like MasterCard, Visa, etc., PayPal. And so there is a lot of agony over that because it does make their work harder. They're losing money that they earned to these companies who are just taking the money away.
We've actually gone through all the questions. That's an incredible feat. Maybe one other question you see that's just come in: why sex workers consider sex work as work?
maybe this would be a good opportunity for me to talk about linguistic frames and why they matter, right? So there are different, depending on the agenda of every group and depending on what they think of sex work, whether they think it can ever be agentic, they are going to use different language. So the language that is used in the anti-trafficking sector in the Philippines or by anti-sex work feminist groups is women in prostitution, because they want to emphasize that women are in a particular situation that they don't control, right? The word prostitute, or sometimes they even use prostituted women to emphasize that it is something that is done to a passive, helpless actor, right? The word prostitution is a bit more contested because it has baggage. And in the context of the Philippines, it is a derisive term, right? It's derogatory, but it is being reclaimed. So in the UK, you have the English Collective of Prostitutes. In New Zealand, you have the New Zealand's Prostitutes Collective. So some sex workers are happy to refer to themselves as prostitutes. Sex work is the term I've chosen in my work and what most of them prefer, because it suggests that, like any other worker, this is work for them. It is not their all-encompassing identity that they're victims, but it signals labor in the same continuum of work as domestic workers, factory workers, or any other worker. So there are political and ideological stakes in the language that we use.
Right. Well, we have indeed gotten through the questions. You've already spoken about, or do you want to go ahead and take one more? Sorry, it just came in about the main recommendation you would have.
There are many. The first thing is, can we please listen to them? And can we make it easy for them to have a seat at the table? So I'm going to give an example. They were invited to a town hall consultation in some local government. This was in 2013. There were also cops in this consultation, and they felt comfortable enough to disclose that they were sex workers. And so they gave their opinions, right? After 3 days, 2 of them got arrested. So we need to make sure that there's a safe space for sex workers to influence the policy conversation, not just have a seat at the table. So when I'm saying this, I'm referring to like the Nancy Fraser kind of, theory of justice, where they have to be part of shaping the conversation, not just entering into already a pre-agreed, outcome and just sitting there to rubber stamp it. So people need to be challenged on their views. And the state needs to be willing to recognize that it's not just a rescuer in this situation, it's also an enabler of vulnerabilities. And that's going to require a big paradigm shift. So, there are many recommendations, but that would be my main one, that we should be listening to the people we're trying to help.
Excellent, Sharmila. That's great. And as I said, in terms of the substance, but also in terms of the efficiency, I think we have set a record here. I haven't counted the number of questions, but I think we're approaching a dozen. So I'd like to wrap up at this stage, and all that remains is to thank first our audience for those interesting questions and for your interest in the topic. To thank the organizers of PhilS4 and this ongoing very worthwhile series, and last and obviously not least, to thank you, Sharmila, for this excellent presentation, and also your very engaged response to these very in-depth often queries. So I think it's fair to say a very enlightening session. And again, thanks to all for taking part. And as I understand it, this has not just been streamed live, but it will of course be available online if anybody wants to go over things that have occurred. And thanks to Sharmila for making the references available so that those who want to follow up on your work can do so. So with that, if there are no objections from any of the technical support here, I will adjourn the session. Thanks to everybody for attending. Thanks again, Sharmila. Thank you.